everyone, it's Mel Bound here, the founder of TMR. Welcome to the second session in a series of interviews that we are bringing to you as part of our My Time, My Space, My Pace campaign that aims to raise awareness of the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women's physical health and on their mental health over the past 2 years, and to really empower women to start to get regular movement back into their lives. Now, last week, I know some of you were able to join us. I talked to Dr. Niloufar Ahmed about the idea of collective trauma and the impact that the pandemic itself has had on our physical and mental well-being. And if you haven't had a chance to catch up on that session yet, there'll be a link in the comments below. And I really urge you to go back and watch that. There were some really brilliant bits of insight from Dr. Ahmed. This week, we wanted to shift the focus slightly to COVID-19 itself and the impact the virus, its symptoms and the after effects are having on our bodies and on our mental health. In our COVID-19 2 years on survey that so many of you took part in, 62% of women told us that they've suffered from COVID at least once in the past 2 years. And 15% of you told us that you're experiencing symptoms of long COVID. And 73% of you have told us it's had a negative impact on your physical health. So those numbers are absolutely huge. Now, as many of you know, in the early stages of COVID, I was shielding, and that was an incredibly anxious time. And about 6 weeks ago, it finally got me, and I was actually quite unwell. And I'm definitely still feeling the after effects on my energy levels, on my sleep, on my focus at work, and all sorts of other things. And I'm struggling to return to regular running. So I'm really excited about today's session. It's a chance to have a look at the impact the virus has had on our physical health and on our mental health, and how it's stopping us from building movement back into our everyday lives, as well as looking at some of the practical steps we can take to help us start to get back to some form of physical activity without it feeling too overwhelming or unachievable. So with all of that in mind, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome two fantastic women to the panel today. We have Dr. Jo Daniels and Claire Callaghan with us. Claire and Jo, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can I hand over to you first, Claire, just to give a little bit of an intro to yourself and to your work, and then pass on to Jo to do the same.
Sure. Well, hi, my name's Claire, as Mel said. I've been around the TMR scene for a little while, for years actually, so I've known Mel for quite a long time, done the run angeling thing, love running myself, but I'm coming to this from a physiotherapy angle today to really talk about COVID and hopefully answer some questions that people might be wondering themselves about COVID, long COVID, and how it affects their physical activity and their physical well-being and exercise, which clearly then links in with what Jo will speak about from the anxiety or mental well-being perspective. Yeah, much like Mel, I think, like many others, COVID did make me a little bit nervous at the start, and I'm asthmatic as well, so I expected that actually if I got it, it would be my chest that would be the problem. When I did finally get it last August, I wasn't too bad, so I was pleasantly surprised, went along through that. And then on about sort of day 8, day 9, after having a little bit of respiratory effects, a little bit of shortness of breath, a little bit of thoracic pain, but nothing to really worry about, I had the most horrendous headaches to the point that I felt like I was having a stroke. I mean, I know that sounds like a massive exaggeration, but it went on for days. I've seen a neurologist since then to try and calm down these headaches that I keep getting. It is getting better, and I am taking the advice of the neurologist and doing everything he has told me to the letter. I've also seen a neurophysio as well about that, just to make sure. I mean, it probably seems a little bit like overkill, but just I'm so desperate to get rid of these headaches that I'm following their advice as well, with some exercises that they've given me to address that. Yeah, I mean, I suppose we'll come to it later, but perimenopause is, affecting a lot of women as well in the TMR community. So that might be something that I explore should things not calm down as to the hormonal effects. But I'm pleased to say it's all getting much better. I'm getting back into my exercise now, and I'm not as fatigued as I was 6 months ago. So there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but it's a work in progress, as I think it is for a lot of people. And just who knows how much is pandemic fatigue as well. So, and I'll be running through some physiological effects of COVID, really. So, yeah.
Thank you, Claire. Over to you, Jo. Could you give us a little bit of an intro to you professionally and also your personal experience of COVID?
Absolutely. So hi, my name is Jo Daniels. I'm a clinical psychologist and senior lecturer at the University of Bath. Prior to the pandemic, I did a lot of research on health anxiety in medical conditions. So when COVID came along, it was a good chance for me to pivot my research and think about the psychological impact of COVID over the course of the pandemic. Over the pandemic, I've been doing a lot of research, but also a lot of work with the media and with the public. And in my mind, the whole time has been destigmatizing mental health. And as we've alluded to already, it's been an incredibly anxiety-provoking time for all of us, really, for a lot of complicated reasons. And it's felt really important to talk really clearly about how normal it is to feel anxious when we're facing a novel virus that is potentially life-threatening. So I've been doing a lot of that over the pandemic. Personally, I too have been shielding, and we were talking earlier about the irony of me talking about health anxiety in my research in very public forums when I myself had felt quite health anxious. And had been worried about getting COVID myself. And when I eventually got COVID, despite being quite clinically vulnerable, I was hardly affected. And that itself actually brought some complexity with it, because I thought, well, what does that mean? You know,
Yeah.
why am I not, you know, why is my husband more affected than I am? So it's been an incredibly interesting time, and really shines a spotlight on the uncertainty that the pandemic has brought, is that we've all had certain expectations about how we'd be affected, you know, views about vaccination, what the outcomes might be for us. And it's just been an incredibly complicated time where we're learning all the time, and we still are. So I'm not facing any of those long COVID symptoms, thankfully, but I am continuing to do some work with those who are shielding, and hopefully come to talk about that a little bit later, so that I can help debunk some myths, maybe make people feel a bit more normal about what they're experiencing, and maybe share some stats, which I think we all find reassuring sometimes, around who's affected and how much, and particularly looking at that gender angle as well, and how we're affected as women. Obviously me bringing my gender and my role as a mum to this as well, and maybe talking about that with all of you here.
Brilliant, thank you, Jo. And I know that there's so much excitement about this campaign generally, as an opportunity to just take a moment, I think, and recognise the last 2 years as being incredibly challenging in all sorts of different ways, and women not wanting to just kind of move on to life as normal without recognising the things that we've all been through. So we've had so many questions about today's session, so if it's okay, I'm going to dive straight into those with one for you, Claire. So one of the big topics of conversation within the community, with the TMR community, has been around post-viral fatigue, and that kind of lingering feeling of tiredness and brain fog as well. And that's actually something that I'm still experiencing a few weeks after having COVID. And even sitting in front of a screen or on a long phone call can be really exhausting afterwards. So I wondered if you could talk to that a little bit, just from a physical perspective, thinking about physiologically what's going on in our bodies post-virally, and what women might be able to do to manage some of those symptoms that they're experiencing.
Okay, sure. Well, if you're thinking about COVID, and I'm going to try and keep this pretty simple, but if you think about what COVID actually does to our bodies, it is obviously a respiratory infection. That you have this 3 phases: the early viral infection phase, when you've actually got the virus, you're in those first few days, and you might be getting sort of a little bit of some of the more common symptoms, the sore throat, the shortness of breath, and so on, or maybe not. Then there's a second phase, which is more the pulmonary or respiratory phase, and you might be becoming more symptomatic. So more shortness of breath, more fatigue. You might be getting some thoracic pain, some rib pain, feeling tired, nauseous, all the classic symptoms, or not. But that's the second phase. And that can be sort of, you know, this sort of classic 10 to 14 day period that we might associate with COVID. So the first sort of 14 days. Now, whilst you're in the midst of that phase, your body will then be reacting. So you'll then be starting to get into the third phase, which is the inflammatory response phase. And everyone's inflammatory response or immune system response is going to be different. So when you're going, and that phase is a much longer phase. So some of us will be in that phase for a shorter period, some of us for a very long period. And it seems fairly, having read around it, it seems fairly indeterminate. There's not a number on that. But it's that third phase that can be ongoing. So you might think, oh, like I did, you might think of, feeling okay, and then things linger and they linger and they linger. And I think a lot of people have experienced that in various forms. So getting back to, well, what's actually happening there? If you think about, again, taking it back to its core, being a respiratory virus, if you think about your lungs like a bit of an upside down tree, so the air comes in through your windpipe and then it goes off into these branches, and then you've got the air sacs at the end, your alveoli, where the oxygen comes in and it goes into the bloodstream, and then the carbon dioxide comes back. Okay, so thinking about that. So if you've got inflammation that's affecting those linings, even if you're not really feeling it, there might be some after effects of that. And breathing is something that we take for granted. And if your breathing is affected, then obviously through this inflammation and so on, then you could be quite tired from that. And that can have ongoing effects. Now, I'm not talking about the people who end up in intensive care, who have obviously the worst experience of that. But for all of us, we may experience that at some low grade level or moderate grade level. So then if we're thinking about it from an exercise perspective, that's going to have a real impact on how we get back to exercise and our expectations around that. So I think it's really important to bear that in mind when we sort of think about getting back to exercise, that we've actually been through this inflammatory phase. And it could be ongoing. So even though we feel okay to a point, when we push those systems, our cardiovascular system and our heart and our lungs, there could be some ongoing inflammatory responses. And then our immune systems are all different too. So some of us will cope with this, but that differently or better than others. And I think the science is still trying to catch up with that. Yeah. How deeply do you want me to go on in terms of, do you want me to save the resources stuff till later, Mel? In terms of what, because
I think there are specific resources that are relevant to that question. I think it would be useful to mention them, and then we can add them in the comments for anyone who's interested in any more afterwards.
Yeah. So if we're then thinking, okay, so let's take, a TMR mum who's thinking, right, I had COVID 2 or 3 weeks ago. I'm starting to feel a bit better. What should I do now? When should I make these decisions, and how should I make these decisions? It really does come down to pacing it gently and prioritizing as well. You really have to sort of take it back to absolute basics. And if you look at the advice that's been given out by the Royal College of Occupational Therapists, which is clearly closely linked to the physiotherapy thing, it's all about pacing, planning, and prioritizing. So everyone's going to be at a different point in that spectrum. So it might be that if you're getting tired of just walking your kids to school or putting the laundry out, then clearly you're not ready to take that next step. And that might be your priority, is actually getting through the day without feeling like, you're really suffering, your COVID symptoms or your fatigue. Yeah. Equally, some people might be feeling not too bad and get to 2 or 3 weeks post-virally and think, actually, I feel okay. I feel like I want to start doing things. What should I do? So there is some guidance, and again, we can put this all in the notes afterwards, but there's some guidance that's come out from the British Journal of Sports Medicine that's aimed at this very more active population. And I think there are probably people in that TMR community who might be doing events who do fall into this population. But even at that level, the guidance is very stringent, that for the first 2 weeks, you really don't do much at all. So for the first 10 days, it is absolute rest. So if, whether you're, a mum who's coping with a couple of kids, or you're a female athlete training for the Olympics, it's 10 days, no activity, end of discussion. Then
literally nothing. It's literally like not even sitting in front of the screen, isn't it? Because
it's rest, full rest. Yes.
It's incredibly hard for most of us, isn't it? Because we have really busy lives. And we think, oh, rest means don't go and do any exercise. We don't think rest means literally lie in bed or sit on the sofa and do nothing. And for a lot of us, that's actually not very practical either, because we've got kids and other things that are going on. So it's quite challenging, that, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think it's kind of, in a way though, it's reassuring, because I think we think that everyone else is out there doing all these amazing things. Why can't I do it? But actually that's what's advised. And then in terms of return, there's a very graduated, so until you're off all treatment, symptom free, not taking the odd paracetamol to manage your symptoms, it really is full rest. And then when you move on from that, there's a very graduated protocol of having 2 days where you do less than 15 minutes of physical activity at a point where your heart rate's getting up to about under 70% of its maximum.
Okay.
So I don't want to get too technical into everyone having to look at their Fitbit and thinking, what's my heart rate? But, that's not getting out of breath. That's still being able to exercise and, have a chat with a friend.
That's really a brisk walk.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's a phase of a number of days where you gradually increase that time up from under 15 minutes to under 30 minutes to under an hour, and looking at the heart rate, being under 80% of the maximum throughout that period. So, and this is talking about professional level. So if we're thinking it right, let's bring it back to before we expect them to go back to what they were doing before. So if we're thinking about that as being the research baseline, and then we think about the rest of us who are also juggling, not getting that support, doing it also on our own without a team of people around us. I think there's no rush is really the message that's most important. It's all about planning it and taking it gradually. It's a gradual process, and it's going to be unique to each and every one of us.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you from a psychological angle. Obviously, some of these kind of post-viral symptoms that we're experiencing are real, but I'm very real because I've experienced them myself. But I wonder whether you could talk to that question from a psychological perspective, and thinking about things like genuinely feeling like you need to go and have a lie down in the middle of the day, versus actually needing to have that period of sleep. And what's actually going on there?
Well, as Claire's talked about, really, it's so individual, our responses to illness, and we bring so much of who we are to that response. One of the difficult things, as I've said, with COVID, and especially long COVID as well, because we are really still learning. We're not sure about the recovery. We're not sure who's affected most and why. We can see there's certain patterns there, such as women being affected. But again, it's all very new to us, is that we have that uncertainty. We don't know, are we going to be the ones to get long COVID? How long is it going to last? What do these symptoms mean? So because this is a new illness, we don't have any rule of thumb. If we have a chest infection or a cold, we have some understanding of what it feels like when it gets a little bit better, or when we should call the doctor when it's got worse. But with long COVID, we don't have that. And because if you phone the GP, they might say, well, this is quite normal for COVID, or they might say, oh, this is worrying, and people have got their oximeters at home and these sorts of things. So we're really in new territory, and people are being very hypervigilant to their symptoms, watching out for changes in their breathing and their pain and fatigue, but they're not really knowing what to do with that. And sleep and rest is a good example of that, really, because we've historically been told that we do need to rest and listen to our bodies. But then, as Claire's pointing out, there is a place where we do need to start becoming active again. And sometimes, especially if you're not used to fatigue or sleepiness and tiredness, telling the difference can be quite tricky. And sometimes people struggle with the difference between fatigue and needing sleep, because fatigue doesn't necessarily mean that you've got a sleep deficit, but you certainly feel like you need to lie down and sleep. So I think, as I say, what's tricky is that we don't really understand this condition, and we can use these guidelines, but psychologically we don't really feel adept at responding to it. So it's really difficult, especially if you're a mum. You've got your expectations of what you want to be doing as a mum, and it's really hard not delivering on, I mean, like you say, that walk to school. For a lot of us, that's crucial. It feels like, you know, if you can do that, that really speaks to who you are as a mum and what you're able to achieve. And if that's compromised, that can be really hard to swallow. So we have to think about those aspects as well, and bear in mind that this is, for the majority of people, a temporary thing, and it's unlikely to be long term. And being able to accept that for a short period we may not be able to do that, but we can build up, is important. To take that long view really, and to be compassionate towards ourselves if we can't do the things that we used to be able to do. And like Claire says, I would echo everything Claire says, of taking our time, really not rushing, and just being kind to ourselves as mums.
Yeah, which is something that as mums we actually find really hard to do, really, isn't it? We're kind of so worried about, are the kids okay? Is the other half okay? Are our friends okay? Are our next door neighbours okay? And then right at the last minute, not kind of considering ourselves and whether we're okay in all of this. And that kind of self-compassion is so important in all of this, isn't it?
It is. We're often the bottom of the pile, and when you know, when you think about it, really, is that I'm sure that my children wouldn't notice who was walking them to school most of the time. It's the pressure is internal, and that's what we have to recognise, is that we're really only ever going for good enough parenting. That's what the literature says. We just have to be good enough, and that includes a broad view, as if, you know, if we're a bit cranky because we're tired, we're not able to deliver, the bigger picture means that's okay, and we're actually modelling in actually how to respond to illness. Actually, we do need to take care of ourselves. We need to teach our children that too.
I hope everyone literally writes that down in bold letters and pins that on their fridge. That's such an important message, isn't it? Jo, I wanted to talk a little bit too. We talked a little bit earlier about just the kind of novelty. I mean, I'll call it novelty, but just the novelty of a virus like COVID, which, you know, it came on so quickly. It's affected everyone. In the early days, where we didn't really know what was happening and where it was going to go, and there was a lot of fear and anxiety around that. And I wonder whether you could talk a little bit to that, about the impact of the lack of knowledge and the lack of certainty on how we dealt with our mental health, and how that's affecting our ability to recover as kind of life does go back a little bit more to normal.
Yeah, well, it's been a really interesting time. So we started our research right at the beginning of the pandemic. So in March, in the first lockdown, was our first study. And we asked people about their anxiety levels, their depression, and also health anxiety, which is my expertise before. So just to say a little bit about what that is, health anxiety is that preoccupation that you may be seriously unwell, so that either you're unwell now or that you're going to be seriously unwell in the future, and you can see why that may be relevant to COVID. But what we also asked people about was their tolerance of uncertainty. So I'm sure we'd all agree that living with uncertainty has been one of the biggest challenges over the pandemic. And we also asked people how they were coping. And again, I'm sure we can all agree that another one of the hardest things was being stripped of our normal coping strategy. So where we might normally meet up with our friends or go for a run, go to the gym, we couldn't do that. And that's how we normally dealt with that frustration in our lives, tension, stress. Instead we were cooped up at home with people 24 hours a day, some of us homeschooling, and the stress levels were really high. So what we found was that a quarter of people were anxious, a quarter of people were depressed, and about 40% of people were either anxious or depressed at that time, which is much, much higher than we would expect, which would normally be around 10%. So it's really, really high. Yeah. Health anxiety levels were also elevated, about 15% of people, whereas normally it would be around 7%. So it's twice as high. But you would expect that, really. If you're not anxious at that point where there's a novel virus that's killing people,
Yeah.
You know, so that's really understandable that people were feeling that way. And we also saw that, you know, people were really struggling with uncertainty. And interestingly, when we asked them about their coping strategies, we found that the relationship between tolerance of uncertainty and mental health was mostly affected by their coping. So more specifically, people who were drinking as a coping strategy, pretend it wasn't happening, not following the rules, they were actually doing much worse mental health wise. And that was actually quite important. It was, in fact, more important, the unhelpful strategies rather than the helpful strategies. You know, there was actually more power in doing the unhelpful thing. And so that's some of that research we shared quite widely, actually, is to say that, you know, it's important to really focus on, at these uncertain times, really focus on these positive strategies. So things like social support, being active where you can, taking control where you can, because everything felt quite out of control at that time, but there were small things that we could control. Some of the other findings were that people who were shielding were the most affected mental health wise. So understandably, they were more affected in terms of coping strategies too, in that actually they really weren't going out at all. So as some of us could go for a walk, they weren't going out, or, you know, shopping, those essential duties, they weren't doing that at all. So they were really stripped of ways to cope with the pandemic, which is really tricky. We also found that women, particularly younger women, were more affected in terms of their mental health, and that the older people were more anxious about their health as well. And, you know, we can put these things together. They make sense. They're intuitive. That older people are more at risk. And people who had mental health problems before were also more at risk. So we used that research then to make some recommendations about how people will respond. So just really engaging with these more helpful strategies and making sure that you're talking to people, and also listening to the right news outlets, really, because there's so much information coming in. It's amazing, and not all of it was reliable. And what we know about health anxiety is that, you know, if you've got exposure to a lot of information about health and you're more on the anxious side, you know, you're more likely to feel quite health anxious. So we then followed that up. It wasn't the same group of people, but a little bit later on, we did some more research just focused on those who were shielding. What somebody said to us in the first study was, yeah, I'm anxious, but I'm actually more anxious about the person I'm shielding. And that was a phenomenon we hadn't come across before, is that there are people who are really anxious about the person that they're shielding. So we asked more about that, and that was in the second wave. And what we found was that generally anxiety rates had gone down. So bearing in mind that at that point we had vaccines, people were starting to have them. We had treatment, so we knew that the mortality rates were dropping as well. But, you know, there's still, you know, 3 million people in the UK who were shielding at that time. So we found that in the general population, anxiety rates went down and depression went down, but those who were shielding, anxiety rates actually went up. So the longer that you had been shielding, the more anxious you were, which again is quite telling and speaks to that, you know, real loss of the coping strategies, that over a long period of time, we know that people really struggle with their mental health if they don't have what they need to lift their mental health and to feel normal. One of the striking things as well was that, as I said, when we looked into that what we call vicarious health anxiety, is that rates were really high. People were really worried about the people that they were shielding. They weren't worried about themselves, they were worried about others. And that really reveals that there's a whole population out there who actually are distressed, psychologically distressed, and not getting any help for it when they're shielding somebody else.
I was going to ask you actually about whether any of your research looked at the impact on kids that were in that position, so children whose maybe parents were shielding, and whether you saw any impact in terms of anxiety and other mental health issues for younger children.
So my research hasn't looked at that, so I mostly focus on adults, but I know that there is obviously research out there which does look at that. I mean, historically, we know that parental anxiety is transmissible. Whether it's, we see that from sort of more learning point of view, is that if a parent is quite anxious, it's quite common for the child to be anxious as well. We did write a paper during the pandemic, because there's so little research on health anxiety in children. We did write a paper on what we know about anxiety and how that might affect children. And obviously there's such a strong link between parental and child anxiety. We could see what we talked about was the fact that if a parent was worried about the child would obviously pick up on that. And what we know is that if you're one of those parents who is constantly worried about the child, how the child interprets that is that there's something to be worried about. And of course, it's very difficult to manage that over a pandemic, because, as we've said, people were dying and still are dying, or have been very, very unwell. And the children are picking up on that. It's on the news. So there's no getting away from it, really. And I think we're going to be learning a lot in the coming months and years about how children are affected. I know my own daughter was anxious, and up until even recently, she wanted to wear a superhero face mask to school, which to me communicates that she has some anxiety about the virus. So yes, we absolutely do know that parental anxiety can be transmissible, but also that works both ways. But I think it's really important to say that a degree of health anxiety is actually quite useful, or a degree of fear, because that mobilizes us. And what I mean by that is that actually, if we weren't a little bit worried and afraid, we would find it harder to follow the guidelines, if you see what I mean. It's giving us that message that this is something to worry about. We must wash our hands, we must wear our face masks. But for the majority of people, this peak in anxiety, it will pass. It's a very normal response to the pandemic, and it will pass over time for the majority of people. The people who are going to continue to struggle with this are more likely to be people who have been struggling in the past already.
Yeah, God, I relate so much to so much of what you just said. I could see Claire nodding away as well, thinking about her own children. God, it's just been so much to navigate, hasn't it, in terms of managing how we feel, and then thinking about our children, and how our attitude to what's happening might be affecting them, and seeing it affecting them and not really knowing what to do. It's been a lot, I think, to manage. If it's okay, Claire, I'm going to switch back to you, and I'm going to ask you a question about another biggie. Has been breathing, and you mentioned it a little bit in your earlier response. So obviously, COVID, well, it's a whole system virus, isn't it? But primarily, it's a cardiovascular and respiratory illness. So I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about just some of those physical symptoms of COVID, that kind of tight chest feeling, which I know not everyone has experienced, but lots of people have, and that kind of shortness of breath that lingers and stays with us while we're exercising. Why is that happening? And why are we feeling that way? And what can we do to kind of reduce those feelings?
Okay, so just going back to what I said earlier, if you're thinking about the inflammation that can happen in the linings of the lung, and COVID can affect how well we can take up oxygen into our tissues, because if you've got any inflammation there, that can affect that. In the more extreme cases, and I'm probably talking about the hospitalization level of cases, or people who really notice that their oxygen saturation levels have really dipped, you could theoretically get some scarring in the tissues as well. So our tissues are designed to be nice and elastic, so our little air sacs would normally be able to open and close a little bit around the so you've got like a little if you can imagine like a tree branch coming down, and then a little sac there. Normally you get this lovely opening and contracting, relaxing of the tissues there. So if you've got any scarring there or any inflammation there, you're not getting this nice opening of your airways. And also the muscles might be sore and really tired as well. So you might just not be getting the oxygen in as easily because of those reasons. Now, even as we get better, research shows that your muscles might not start to work as effectively as they did before. You know, if you get changes in your breathing pattern, even if you get better from the inflammation, some of those changes might linger. So for people who are really struggling, there's some good resources, and again, we'll pop this in the notes, on breathing patterns and how to restore normal breathing. But what I'd encourage everyone to just try for a moment is, and I'll just pop my screen down so you can see. So if you put your hands just there and take a deep breath in and out. Okay, so in normal diaphragmatic breathing, this diaphragm that sits there, you should be getting expansion of your lungs going out to the side, of your ribs rather, going out to the side and in. So a lateral expansion going out and in that way. So for anyone who's struggling with breathing, I'd encourage you just to go back to basics, just have a real feel of your breathing and think, am I breathing coming out to the side, or am I doing a lot of sort of upper respiratory breathing where, now I'm exaggerating there, but that's what I'd encourage people to think about, is what is your normal breathing pattern at rest before we even think about exercise. And what we want to do is promote that normal breathing pattern. And there's lots of arm exercises and things you can do with the upper body to enhance that normal breathing pattern and take it back to basics. So again, I'll pop some Chartered Society of Physio resources in the notes to help with that. And then clearly, as we start to exercise relies on that nice expansion to get that little bit of extra oxygen into our tissues, which we need when we're, running, and our respiratory rate increases when we move and exercise. So we need to be able to cope with that increase in respiratory rate and still have that normal pattern of breathing. And for some of us, that might take some time to get back, or it might literally take that relearning to improve. So if you're struggling with that, try the breathing, but also maybe make sure that before you go tackling higher impact exercise, that you're all right with lower impact exercise and strengthening work as well.
That's great advice, thank you, Claire. And I was going to ask, are there other things in your work that you're seeing that are kind of that are appearing that you might not normally have seen? Other physical symptoms with the women that you're working with? Are there more injuries, aches and pains that you think you can attribute to COVID as well?
It's really interesting. So I've been a physio for about 25 years, and I've dealt with many, many women of all ages. And my core at the moment is a lot of women who are aged between 40 and 60, who statistically are more likely to get long COVID than the broader population. So within that population, I'm seeing a lot of women come to me and they're tired, they're fatigued, they're struggling to get back to their previous level of fitness. Now that could be because of COVID, or it could be for other reasons as well, because obviously, hormonal changes occur around that time as well. They might just be fatigued from the pandemic as well, and the mental stresses and anxieties that Joe's alluded to as well might be impacting them. But I would say, and I'm speaking anecdotally here, I haven't kept stats, but I'm definitely having more women come in, first of all, in those first few weeks post-COVID, just saying, I'm tighter than I normally would be, or I'm struggling to get back to doing what I was doing before. And we've covered some of the reasons why that would be. So I'm seeing more of that. I'm seeing more headaches. I'm definitely people talking about brain fog a little bit more. That seems to be, I know that's not the technical term, but it's a term we all can all relate to, I think, or understand at least. So yeah, I am seeing that. And then in terms of aches and pains, some people do get muscle ache post-virally, and COVID and other viruses are well known for giving that. And it can be where I guess someone like myself can help is differentiating, is it generalized post-viral ache, or is it a specific injury that's causing that muscle ache? And that's where people like myself come in as well.
Yeah, and actually just about my own experience, one of the symptoms I experienced maybe about 3 weeks after I was first tested positive, I started getting really weird kind of stabbing pains in my arms. that initially I was like, am I having a heart attack? And I was literally Googling arm pain and heart attack, and because initially it was in my right arm as well, which is you wouldn't think is, but in the end I kind of was able to rationalize it and think this is actually just part of my recovery, because I knew it wasn't another injury, but it was something else to worry about, wasn't it?
That's exactly right. And I think, again, speaking about that, the randomness of symptoms, people getting random joint pains, random inflammation. There's some research to show that you're more likely to suffer from some long COVID symptoms if you have some other conditions. So, for example, type 2 diabetes, there's a strong link with that. There's also some other autoimmune diseases. There's a possibility that there's a role, that you might be coping with autoimmune issues. I know there's a lot of women who are on thyroxine or have thyroid issues, for example, and that those things can affect your musculoskeletal well-being, and COVID can affect that. So there's a lot of things that potentially are going on, and teasing it out is difficult, and that's probably where things like long COVID clinics come in, really. Yeah.
Wow, God, it's just such a journey.
It's a minefield. Yeah, but yes, all of the above. Yes,
lots of stuff. Okay, I'm going to ask you a question now that's this is aimed at both of you, actually, just thinking about the work that you're doing and the people that you're supporting through your work. And I know there's been some anecdotal and some research evidence into the fact that women have responded differently to the COVID virus and how we're recovering. And I wondered whether you could both just talk to that a little bit in terms of your own work and what you're seeing. And how and just how women are responding differently to what's been happening. Jo, could we come to you first on that one?
Yeah, so as I've alluded to earlier, we know that women have been more anxious over the pandemic, although what I would say about that as well is that women are more likely to respond to surveys. So we should take that into account. But that's what we know generally anyway, is that women are experiencing more anxiety. Also, we know that women have reported some changes in terms of the menstrual cycle and how they have responded to the vaccine, and that's been really interesting, having looked into that research, that actually, again, it's similar with anxiety, is that we know that stress affects our menstrual cycle. We already knew that before COVID came along, so it's no surprise really that it has affected us in that way. But what the research shows is that, like anxiety, it returns to normal, and that we do know that, and that actually, some research as well around how women and their menstrual cycles respond to the vaccine. And actually, the research shows that menstrual cycles are affected by the HPV vaccine and other vaccines. So that's not really new. We knew that before, but again, that goes back to normal. But what's been really interesting about that is there's been some calls to pay more attention to the hormonal cycles of women and how important they must be. And I think, there is, I don't know if you've heard the term COVID keeps, that, there's some positive things we can get out of the pandemic. And that for me feels like a bit of a win for women, is that actually there's some recognition here that hormones are really important, and that it really affects us, and that actually the way that our bodies are made up responds really sensitively to what's going on around us. So I think that's really incredibly positive.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, actually, because I did an interview last week with the BBC about HRT and how kind of post-pandemic there's now a shortage in HRT, and they think that there was a whole discussion around why that might be the case. But I think one of the really positive things is that there is more conversation around women and hormones. And kind of more spaces where women can share their experiences of what's happening with them hormonally, and the realization that perhaps HRT can help. And that's created this kind of increase in demand, which the system hasn't quite caught up with yet, which is obviously needs to be dealt with. But on the other hand, there are a lot more conversations around the importance of hormones and how they affect women's lives. And that can only be a positive thing.
Absolutely. And I think we also need to bear in mind that, particularly for people who may be viewing this, mums, is that we may be more affected in more indirect ways, such as, the interference with our our mental loading when we're having to manage homes and families and children and work as well, and that actually these setbacks can be quite significant for us, especially if, you know, our children, partners are affected by it, that there's an indirect impact, as well as women being more likely to be affected by long COVID. The knock-on effects is a real ripple effect for many of us. And of course, you know, I'm generalizing there, that doesn't apply to everyone, but we can see, and we know from the research that I know female academics have been significantly affected as well in their productivity. And I'm sure that, you know, you see that elsewhere. And we need to keep that in mind really moving forward, is that, you know, it's really not over yet for us. There may be a more broad ripple effect on how we're able to function in our normal daily lives.
God, yeah, I mean, that's such an important message, and that's definitely one of the things that we're trying to achieve with this campaign, is to really shine a light on that, so that, you know, not only women are aware of what's happening for us, but, you know, wider society can understand that more ongoing impact as well.
Mm-hmm.
Claire, in terms of your work, what are you seeing? You talked a little bit to you know, some of the things that you're seeing with women that you're treating, but why do you think that women have been particularly affected? Why are they responding differently as we kind of enter this period of recovery?
It's really interesting when you start looking at the research around this, because again, anecdotally, women are reporting this to me, and I looked into it a little bit in, you know, ahead of this, just to pick up the point that Jo was saying about the hormonal changes. So, you know, is it coincidental that the same population that are more likely to be suffering from long COVID are also a population that are potentially perimenopausal or immediately postmenopausal? We don't know, but what we do know is that there's been a piece in the Lancet recently calling for more research into this area, and the Lancet being, you know, a very, you know, one of the leading medical journals out there, and certainly in the broader media, there's more call for that. Newson Health, so Louise Newson, who's quite an eminent and well-known specialist in the menopausal area, she and those in Newson Health have done an online survey, again, of about 460 women, the average age being 46.5, and they found that just over 3/4 of the women, 77% of the women who had some long COVID symptoms found that they were worse just before their period. So it then makes you think, well, what is going on with people's estrogen levels? We know that estrogen has a potentially anti-inflammatory effect. So when you take that estrogen, if just going back to what menopause actually is, it's you know, when you stop producing eggs and your estrogen, testosterone and progesterone levels fluctuate and then fall, and it's at that time of falling that you'll get these changes and potentially symptoms as well. So is something going on there where women are losing some of those estrogen protective benefits, and if they're not on HRT, do they then get these symptoms? We don't know, but it definitely needs to be looked into. And isn't it good that we're talking about it? Because, you know, it needs to be talked about, and I think it's a stage-by-stage process. So, you know, acknowledging what's happened with COVID, knowing where you might be at with your COVID symptoms, and then are there other things going on? Because as these articles acknowledge, you know, are people attributing long COVID symptoms to long COVID, and that's actually perimenopause, or is it happening the other way around, or are there combinations of both, or is there another stress and anxiety? We don't know, and each individual probably needs to explore that with the medical fraternity and allied health fraternity as well for themselves.
Yes, I mean, that in its own right is such an interesting area, isn't it? And I think the main message is, if you're experiencing any of those symptoms that potentially are perimenopausal, to go and talk to your GP and see whether you can get some support with that.
That's it. Yeah, and differential diagnosis, just diagnosing, okay, so let's strip all this back. You've got these symptoms, let's work out where the cause is. Yeah.
God, I mean, I feel like we need to do a whole session just on that topic, because so much to unpick there, isn't there? I'm going to just wrap up with a question specifically about physical activity, from both the kind of psychological side and also physically what's happening with our bodies. So I know a lot of women are very keen to, not necessarily return to where they were pre-COVID physical activity wise, but just to even get started. And they have a lot of questions around that. So Jo, I wanted to come to you first, just to think about from a psychological perspective, people who are anxious about returning to physical activity and how that might impact their recovery. What sorts of advice would you give to women feeling that way?
I think it's important to ask yourself how you eat an elephant. So it's a bite at a time. So particularly for women who are very, very active, they're going to want to go straight back into it, and anything less is going to feel, for some, like a failure. So that's one thing to bear in mind, really, is that actually, if you're training for a marathon, you don't start with a half marathon. And I'm sure that Claire will say more about that side of things. But from the psychological point of view, there's those expectations that we'll be carrying with us about where we should be. But also the first step is the hardest, because very often we find a lot of good reasons why we don't start exercise. Is something to do, it's too cold, don't quite feel right, feel a bit anxious, and so starting small is really, really important. Making a plan, and we've seen that we know from the evidence that actually starting very small and building up with a specific goal in mind. But when I say a goal, I mean something meaningful. So for some people, a run around the block is just not motivating enough to get them out there. So think about what you're aiming for and how you can make that enjoyable. So doing more of what matters, so things that are meaningful. So think about what exercise is right for you, that really, gets you going, maybe gets you a bit excited about going to do it, makes it feel really rewarding, whether that's in a group, maybe something like yoga, or whether it's running on your own, listening to music. So I think forward planning is vital, starting really slow, being mindful of those expectations, bringing that compassion in again. That first run's going to be really hard, and it doesn't mean that you're not doing a good enough job. It just means that the first run was hard and that maybe you need to take it down a notch. But that finding something that matters as a motivation is really important to get you out of the door, whether it's having a dress that you want to get into, or whether it's having an idea of an activity that you want to take part in, that you need to be a bit fitter for, or whether it's just that mental space of being out of the house and not around the family when you've spent so much time. So I would say planning, being mindful of expectations, and making it meaningful.
Yeah, brilliant tips there, Jo. Thank you. And Claire, over to you from a physical perspective. You talked a little bit earlier about pacing and the kind of timing of returning to exercise, but could you just talk to a little bit to the sorts of things women should be thinking about if they're returning to exercise, maybe after quite a long break, if whether or not they've had COVID or they've just over the last couple of years slipped out of the habit of those regular activities? What would you say to them?
Sure. So I tend to work within a framework which I'm going to use the technical terms now, and then I'll break it down what it really means. More of a biopsychosocial approach, really. So there's the biological things that we need to think about, is how our bodies are going to respond to that exercise. So if you've been a bit out of the habit, the last thing you want to do is get started and then get hurt or injured. So you really need to think, what is my level of fitness? Be it COVID related, do I need to just build up a little bit of cardiovascular fitness by walking a bit more before I start running, or doing a bit of walk running? And that's where something like the TMR app, which is the Run30 app, could be really useful for people. You need to think about what is your strength. Strength and balance are really important for women as we get, particularly as we get older. So the 3 different types of strengthening activities that women really need to think about in, childbearing years and beyond, the weight bearing element, which something like walking, running, jumping, jogging gives you. The resisted elements are doing a little bit of strength training. It might be that you do a little bit of weights or do something like swimming, for example, or that's going to give you that bit of, using water as a resistance. and then progressing to your higher impact work. You need to think about that before you just be mindful of it and the planning of that. So as Jo said, you know, you don't start with a half marathon to then go to a marathon, although I have seen people do that. Hence they come see me. You know, it's the planning, it's the gradual. There's a rule, it's called like the 10% rule, which coaches will throw around. There's no evidence behind it, but it's, you know, it's, you don't increase the speed, the distance, the gradient by more than 10% a week. And whilst there's no evidence behind it, it's probably a good thing for people to have in the backs of their minds of gradual progression. The psychology side, Jo's obviously talked about, but lifestyle management is an absolutely huge part of this, a huge part of injuries. Nutrition, sleep, stress, it affects our body's ability to cope with not only things like COVID, but also the anxieties, the physical things that are going on with us from a biological perspective. And then there's the social aspect as well. I think if it helps you, as Jo said, to get out with somebody else, then that's great. And that's where communities like TMR come in. But equally, don't just compare yourself to everybody else, because we all do it, and we all know it's bad for us to do that. But we just do it anyways. It's just, you're running your own race really here in life. You've got to just do what's right for you and within your own circumstances, and get help when you need it, you know, be that professional help or help from someone who can look after your kids to get you out of the house for half an hour, you know, but do ask for the help, or a bit of moral support and encouragement as well. I think, you know, research shows that we need that, and that encouragement and support from a community like TMR can be really useful as well.
Make a difference.
Huge.
Thank you for that, Claire. And just to add as well, in terms of, because I know a lot of people are kind of in that place where they're really not knowing how to take the first step. And we've launched this week a really fantastic resource, a website that sits alongside this campaign. So My Time, My Space, mypace.co.uk. That shares some of the research findings from our own research, but also, more importantly, some signposting to the various ways that women might be able to think about taking that first step and building regular activity back into their lives. You know, from joining a TMR community to downloading the TMR app, to setting up a community, to a bunch of other ideas. And I think what would be really useful would be to also add some of the resources that you've both shared today on that website as a permanent record of somewhere that people can go and find that information if they want it. I found it so useful today, guys. Thank you so much for sparing the time. Jo, was there something else you wanted to say before we wrapped up?
Yeah, I just want to say one last thing, is because we're talking about mental health. It's really important to just say that for those who are struggling with their mental health, it's really normal for your mental health to be affected when you're ill. You just have to think about what it's like to have a bad cold. But if it continues, it's really important to reach out. There's lots of evidence-based therapies out there. So do talk to your GP if you are struggling with your mental health and you continue to do so. Just want to make that one point.
Advice. That's such important advice. Thank you. There was so many kind of golden nuggets in there. I've been madly scribbling notes again, and I'm sure anyone that watches this session will be doing the same. And if there's any questions from anyone watching that we haven't covered, I know Claire and Jo are happy for us to pick those up afterwards and for us to cover those off in our communities. Claire and Jo, was there anything else that I haven't asked you that you've got burning desire to share with everyone? I can see your hands up, Claire.
I feel like a kid in the classroom wanting to say something. Just the same as Jo said. You know, there are long COVID clinics out there that you can be referred to through your GP and the NHS. Needless to say, the queues are long, and there's also an app, which I'm going to make sure I get the exact wording right. Your COVID Recovery, the NHS app. So if you just go on to, you know, app stores, you can get that as well. All I would say about some of the NHS-based resources is they're aimed at people who might be at a lower fitness level, or more having been hospitalized, or, you know, more seriously ill in the early stages of COVID and recovering. And where I think what we're doing here is great, and what you're leading is really, really good, is hitting people when they're over the worst of things. but they're still not back. And you know, and a lot of us are going to take time to adjust to the world as it is, and it's an ongoing process, isn't it?
And that's physically and psychologically and everything else in between as well, isn't it? It's kind of recognizing all of that. So thank you again, both of you. I found that incredibly useful. I know everyone that watches this session is going to gain so much from that. And yeah, all the resources and things that you referred to, we'll definitely share those links as well, so people can read more on those topics if they're interested. Thank you so much. We'll be coming, I can't remember off the top of my head what next week's session is, but we'll be sharing through the community what next Thursday's session will cover. Hope you've found today's session as useful as I have. And yeah, thanks again to Claire and Jay. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Mel.
Thank you. Bye-bye.